So we move on to First and Second Kings. So today we're going to talk mostly about First Kings, but many of the things that we discussed today can sort of be applied to Second Kings because those two were originally one book. We know that for sure. It is possible, recall, that everything from Deuteronomy through Second Kings was originally just one. We call that the Deuteronomistic, that's a word, history. Um, that one's we're a little more unsure if that's true or not. Deuteronomy may or may not have been included in that, but all of this is to say that's important because it demonstrates that all of these stories that we're reading about of Samuel and David and Solomon and Rahab and Joshua and all of these kinds of people are this is one continuous story, right? Whether it was all in one book or not at any time, it's the continuation of a story of a narrative, and so it's not this sort of disjointed bunch of Sunday school stories that we read about. So anyway, outline for First Kings then at least is we kind of move from the Samuels and we get the last days of David as king, and then the rise of Solomon, his son, to be the king. And we hear a lot about Solomon himself, his wisdom, his building activities, his wealth, his sins, his punishment. The division of the kingdom, we'll talk about that in a minute, and then the work and ministry of Elijah. And then that's First Kings. So in First and Second Kings, there's this collection of stories, a whole bunch of kings. We zoom in on some of them and we don't on others. So this is written, or I should say, it's compiled of something like 400 years of Israel's history. So this is written at a later date. It's sort of the collection of the stories that are being told and written about of Israel and Judah. Again, we'll talk about the Israel Judah thing in a second. There are these hints of a whole bunch of sources. You see, I have them there. There's this mention just briefly, the Acts of Solomon and the Annals of the Kings of Israel. It's sort of the King's books. You might imagine is a little bit like a library, where the Deuteronomistic historians, the people who wrote it, went to their bookshelf and said, okay, what is most important for us to understand about sort of the historical period here? And we're going to pick this and this and this. So it's not really picking and choosing per se, but highlighting the most important parts, summarizing the stories as a whole. And we can tell this pretty easily that the latest edition, the final edition, was composed later because it uses phrases like something and something or other is still happening to this day, right? You don't say to this day unless you're well in the future. So that's important for us to keep in mind. Not because it's the theme of the book, so to speak, but we tend to get this idea that when we say this is the divinely inspired word of God, that our brains, I don't know why they do this, but they do, just sort of naturally make an assumption that somebody is following these kings around or following these people around and writing everything down. And then we just get whatever was on their notepad. And that's not really true. It can be divinely inspired on one hand, and also this sort of collection of stories over hundreds of years, because that's what it is. It can be both of those things at once. So the United Kingdom is no more, it says. It's going to use the phrase United Kingdom. I'm going to use the phrase United Kingdom. I don't mean the Union Jack. I don't mean England, uh, uh, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, right? The United Kingdom is um, Judah and Israel. So recall how we got here. Um, it had been in the period of the Judges. They'd come into the promised land, right? We're moving out of Joshua and they've come into the promised land, and now they have to figure out how in the world we're going to live here. And in the Judges period, there are a bunch of loosely connected, scattered tribes all over the place. Um, and then they over time move in the Samuel period to saying we want a king. And so there's a king over all of Israel, and there's a couple of kings, and then the United Kingdom divides into two groups. There's a North and there's a South. It sounds a little bit like our history of the United States, right? The United Kingdom is divided by North and South. Um, and so you can see on the map here, um, kind of sort of the shape of modern day Israel. The orange here is Judah, the southern kingdom. The green here is Israel, the northern kingdom. Just to kind of give you an idea of where we're at here, you can see if you look closely, here's Gaza. That's in the news today a lot, Ashkelon and Ashdod, um, which was a Philistine area in that time. So that's when we refer to North and South, when we refer to Israel and Judah, that's what we're referring to. And so the United Kingdom is no more. So there's this differing understandings of covenant between North and South. So for the North, Israel, the green, for the North, the covenant with God, this agreement with God, so to speak, is yeah, we're on Team God, but we really think we can worship wherever, right? We're good on the Torah, but we're not all that interested in David's line of being king and his sons being the king and his sons after that being the king. So think about this geographically here. You see where the dividing line is, and if you look closely, Jerusalem is right here in Judah. It's close, but it's still in Judah. It's in the southern kingdom. The northern folks were saying, gosh, do we really need to come all the way down here to worship God? Can't we come up to here in Dan, way up here, and can't we worship God there? And that was kind of a big deal. The Southern Kingdom said, "Yeah, we're on Team David, right?" Well, you can imagine why. I mean, Jerusalem was the centerpiece of the Southern Kingdom, and the Davidic line, we'd call it, is just synonymous with Jerusalem, and so you can see how just their geography would lead them to favor that sort of idea. They're pro temple. You got to worship in Jerusalem. That's where God's at. Look in the Torah, right? And so you see these they're butting heads over these things, which you might say sounds kind of unimportant, but it was the issue of the day. And we see this continues to be ongoing tension way into the future. We have these long-standing feuds. Samaritans, you remember those folks in Jesus's time? Um, were uh, without getting too deeply into the weeds here. Here's Samaria right here in the northern kingdom, and when we'll read later about uh, the exile, when all these people at one time or another go into slavery, some of them stay back and they become half breeds, they become Samaritans, and it's this ongoing feud that is not neatly ever really resolved, and even to this day, right? We see that this area of the world is a hotbed of um, frankly, political violence and religious violence, and always fighting over land. And I mean, that's not a new story in so many ways. The fights themselves are different, but the fact that there's fighting is not new. So okay, we talked about that. So there's these bunches of kings that we read about in First and Second Kings. This applies to both books. Each king is judged according to the ideological and religious views of the Deuteronomistic historian. In other words, the people who wrote it down and compiled it, we have this sort of strange job as readers of Scripture to say, okay, so this is inspired by God, and people wrote it. How do we hold both of those things up? And there's always this tension: Old Testament, New Testament. But each king is judged very clearly. What this king did was good. What this king did was bad. Right? It was evil in the sight of the Lord, or was good. There's not a whole lot of middle ground offered here. Um, and you can just Google a chart of the kings of each kingdom, and you can kind of see how they stack up, so to speak, who was good, who was bad. Um, the kings who promoted syncretism, we'll call that syncretism, improper mixing of religiosity with other groups. They were evil, right? That's sort of the basic danger of having a king, isn't it? Right? I mean, rather than having a judge or who's kind of in the line of like a religious leader or prophet, um, having a king who has all the power eventually begins to bring in things that are not of God. I mean, that's just human nature. And then the kings who promote faithfulness to God and who reformed and centralized worship in Jerusalem um, were viewed as good. And so you see that a lot of the northern kingdoms, a lot of the northern kings who weren't all that interested in Jerusalem are judged as being bad. Um, what do we do with that? Hard to say. There's a lot in First Kings, so I apologize if this one's a little long, but there's this idea that keeps coming up: the sin of Jeroboam. Jeroboam was a northern king, and so what he did, he was in the green. What he did was he said, uh, "Oh my gosh, these people way up here, Tyre and Sidon and Dan, do they really have to go all the way down to Jerusalem just to worship God? Can't we just set up some satellite temples up here, right? I mean, really, is it that big of a deal?" Um, and so he set up these centers up here in Dan and Bethel, and they weren't temples to God, so to speak. They were kind of temples to God, but ironically, they also brought in literally golden calves. Does that sound familiar? Right? I mean, the story sort of repeats itself. They want to worship the golden calves, and it's not that they're against God. They're not directly saying, our God is bad. They want to worship God. They just want to worship the golden calf too. It's like they've got their spouse and then somebody on the side, right? Um, they've they're sort of intermixing and mingling and syncretism, right? It's this mishmashing of religious traditions. And the Deuteronomistic historian and the Torah, for that matter, they don't offer much middle ground on that. The sin of Jeroboam is this syncretism. You worship God and you worship God and you worship God. That's sort of the gist of the Ten Commandments, right? Have no other gods before me. Don't make false idols, right? I mean, that's the thing. That's um, that's right up there at the top of the top 10. And so you see how that would be judged as bad because the king in north or south got to frankly control the religious practices of the day. And then finally, we're introduced to Elijah in First Kings. Elijah is a prophet, not a king. And Walter Brueggemann says that prophets speak truth to power. You've heard that in other contexts, politics and otherwise, but that's what Brueggemann said. Prophets speak the truth to power. And so that's exactly what Elijah does. Is he's out confronting the idol worship of the day, and he enacts these miracles. And there's so much to say about Elijah that we don't really have time to say. But that's I know that's a lot. That's First Kings. Read carefully, listen carefully. There's a ton of good stuff, important stuff in the Kings books that help to set the scene for the rest of the Old Testament and the rest of the Bible, for that matter.